In this short video lecture, we're going to talk about creating sub-procedures in Visual Basic. The whole purpose of creating a sub-procedure is to take your code, which can be repetitive and be very long, and break it up into smaller, more easily managed parts. The breaking up of a program is called modularization, and that is a key word. So modularization is where we take a program and we're going to break it up into different parts or modules. Now the reasons why we want to do that, one, it divides the program into those smaller, more manageable parts, which is much easier to understand and to program when we break things down. And it also creates a lot less code redundancy. So instead of having a lot of repeated code, we're simply going to move that code out into its own sub-procedure and then have it run whenever it needs to do so. This also increases the flexibility of using our code whenever it's needed. Okay, so what is a sub-procedure? So far we've been working with event procedures. The code responds to whenever an event happens, such as the user clicks a button. We're now going to create what are called sub-procedures, and this is where we're going to have a block of code, and that code is going to execute only when we tell it to. So it's going to execute in response to a call. Now, in order to do that, we're going to first learn how to set up our sub-procedure. To do that, we're going to either make the sub-procedure private or public. Private means that it can only be called inside of that module. Public means that it can be called outside. So public and private are going to determine the accessibility of that procedure, where it can be called. Public is the default. Now the first line of our sub-procedure, which is going to be declaring it, is called the header of that sub-procedure. Each sub-procedure is going to enclose code between that header and the end sub, and then you have your code body, whatever you want to execute between the two. Okay, so again, the sub-procedure, a public one, can be accessed from any module within the project, whereas the private sub can only be accessed within that same module. You should use private unless there is a specific reason to have something as public. Okay, declaring one. This is an example of a sub-procedure called calculate. So we have the header here, public sub calculate, and then we have the footer, which is end sub, and within that we're going to have our code body. Now within this sub we're going to have some variables. Those variables can only be used inside of the sub, so they're going to be local to that sub. And then here we're getting some input, and then here we're running the calculation. So this block of code is only going to execute if the sub calculate is called. Otherwise, it never executes. So how do you actually get it to execute? You're going to use a call statement. You can choose to put call in front of it or not. It's deprecated, meaning that in previous versions you had to, but in more recent versions you don't. It still works, so you can still put call. And all you're going to do is write call, and then you're going to actually put the name of the sub. You have to have these parentheses, and Visual Basic, if you hit enter after the E here, would actually put the parentheses for you. However, it's really good practice to go ahead and put those parentheses yourself. The parentheses are what tells the compiler that it is a subroutine that it's going to be running. So you can either say call, calculate, or just calculate. Now, we did not have any values passed. We simply called the sub and had the sub run everything. However, we can actually pass values. And when we pass values, those are called arguments or actual parameters. And that's what goes inside of those parentheses in our call statement. Now there are two different ways that we can pass values. One is by val and the other is by ref. So we have a value parameter and a reference parameter, and we're going to look at both of those in detail. Value parameters are the default. If you notice with the button clicks, you've seen these by val statements inside the parentheses whenever you've created them, and those are value parameters that are being sent. Now, again, those are event procedures, not sub-procedures that we're going to be creating. However, they also use by val. For us, value parameters are simply going to pass the value to that sub-procedure. So it's going to take a value in, say, a button click, and it's going to send it to the sub-procedure. It's not actually going to change the value of that variable that's the argument. It cannot be changed, and by val doesn't return any value. So it's more of a one-way street. It's going to pass a value over to that sub-procedure, and the sub-procedure is going to do something with it. So the value parameter, it's going to actually create a local variable in the procedure. Again, it's not going to change what is happening in where it was called. The order of the arguments, the number of the arguments have to be the same. So if in my header I have two integers, then in my call I also have to have two integers. Also, I can not only pass variables, but I can pass a constant, a value, or an expression such as x plus 2. Now, again, and I'm stressing this several times, variable arguments passed by value are not changed. So they're used, but that's it. So here's an example for us to look at. All right, say I have this in a button click, and I have my numbers declared, and I get my value, and then I'm going to call calculate. Now, this value is going to be in this variable for my input, and then this one will be this. DBL number 1 and DBL number 2 are again called arguments or actual parameters. They're going to send the value over as I have noted here in the arrows. So the value, if I had put in 2 and 1, 2 and 1 are sent down to those variables. Then these become local variables that I can use within this calculate subroutine. So this is going to be my call statement. It's going to send down and activate this subroutine so it's executed. These values can then be used, as I have here, to determine what the answer is, and then I've simply displayed the answer. Now, within the header, these are called formal parameters. Just like in your call statement, they're called actual parameters. So, again, the calculate DBL number 1, DBL number 2 is going to call the procedure and pass our two arguments over. So it's going to send those values over. The header here for our subroutine is going to get those values in DBL num1 and DBL num2. It's going to send that information over. These are our formal parameters, and then the calculate subroutine is going to use that information. Again, DBL number 1 is the first argument, so it's going to go into DBL num1, which is the first parameter. DBL number 2 is the second, so it's going to go into the second one. Because I have two doubles here, I have to have two doubles in my matching subheader. So the number, the data types, and the order of the arguments must match the number, data types, and order of the parameters. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we also have a second type of parameter. This is a reference parameter. This reference parameter doesn't actually create a new place in memory. It's going to basically represent the same storage location as in the variable given in the call statement. So we're going to call those by ref instead of by val. Now, passing by ref actually passes a reference to the variable itself. In other words, it's going to send over its address, its memory location. Because it's actually sending over the memory location, the subprocedure can change the value of that variable. So ByRef is more of a two-way street. So an example, whenever we want to send something over and have it manipulated and then we need access to that value, we want to use ByRef. So here's an example, same type of thing that we looked at last time for the ByVal, except for this time I've added DBL answer and I've made it a ByRef. So notice down here I've got ByRef instead of ByVal. So it's going to send over and say, here's my location. The calculate is going to determine the answer, and then that answer will be placed back into DBL answer, and it will pass that information back to DBL answer up in the button click. So I can show the actual result up in my button click as opposed to having to show the answer down and calculate. And then later, if I need to use DBL answer, it's going to be accessible for me. So again, DBL number 1, DBL number 2 are both value parameters. So it's a one-way street. It's going to send these values over. Say I've got 1 and 1. Then for the ByRef DBL answer, it's going to say, here's my location. Say I'm located at 0 F1. And so that's a hexadecimal number. So say I'm located here. So it's going to say, here's my location. It will come up with the answer, which is 2. This will put the answer back in that memory location that, again, the button click actually knows what that answer is. So it can have access to it, which is why it can use it in the button click. So that's it for sub procedures, and we will talk about other procedures later.